The steel is still warm when they pull it from the sand. It is early July 1944, and somewhere along a stretch of Norman coastline that American soldiers have come to call by a different name entirely, a work party from the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron is salvaging German beach obstacles. The tide is out. The men move among the wreckage of an invasion that happened less than a month ago. Tangles of barbed wire half buried in wet sand, wooden posts splintered by naval gunfire, and everywhere, scattered across the tidal flats like the bones of some strange geometric animal, the welded steel structures the Wehrmacht planted here to gut landing craft before they could reach the shore. The Germans called them Tschetschenigel, Czech hedgehogs. The design is simple. 3 or 4 heavy steel beams, each cut from railway iron, welded together at angles so that the finished structure always presents at least one sharp point upward, no matter how the tide rolls it. The idea was that a landing craft driving toward the beach at high tide would impale itself on these points, or at least be held in place long enough for artillery observers in the bluffs above to call in fire. Thousands of them were planted along the invasion beaches in the months before June 6th. Now they are junk, scrap. The assault waves came in at low tide, when the obstacles were exposed and could be cleared by combat engineers under fire, and the German defensive plan, like so many German defensive plans that week, failed to account for what the Allies were actually willing to do. The men pulling these steel beams out of the sand do not know, yet, what they are going to build with them. But one of them has been thinking. The bocage begins a few kilometres inland from the coast. If you are flying over it at several thousand feet, as Allied reconnaissance aircraft did throughout the spring of 1944, it looks like nothing more threatening than farmland. Small fields, irregular in shape, bordered by hedgerows, the kind of landscape you might see in the English countryside, or parts of rural Belgium, or anywhere in northern Europe where farmers have been working the same land for centuries. The photographs show a patchwork of green and brown rectangles, dirt roads winding between them, an occasional village or church steeple rising above the tree line. Nothing about these images suggests a military obstacle. The intelligence analysts who studied them before the invasion assessed the terrain as suitable for armoured operations. They expected the tanks to roll. What the photographs did not show, what photographs taken from altitude cannot show, is what the hedgerows actually are. They are not hedges. Not in any sense that an English gardener or an American suburbanite would recognise. They are walls. Earthen walls, some of them 15 feet high and 12 feet thick at the base, built up over centuries by Norman farmers who cleared stones and roots from their fields and piled them along the property lines. Over generations, these piles stabilised. Vegetation took hold, tree roots bored into the compacted earth and laced through it like rebar. Hawthorn and bramble grew thick along the crests. By 1944, many of these embankments are older than the United States of America. They have survived ploughing seasons, floods, wars. They are not going to fall down because a tank drives into them, and they are everywhere. The bocage region stretches roughly 80 kilometres inland from the Norman coast, covering an area larger than the state of Rhode Island. Within it, there are thousands of these enclosed fields, some no bigger than a tennis court, some several acres, but almost all of them irregular in shape, carved out by the boundaries of medieval land grants and inheritance disputes that have long since been forgotten. The roads that run between them are sunken lanes, worn down over centuries by cart traffic, until their surfaces sit several feet below the level of the surrounding fields, with hedgerows rising on both sides. A column of infantry or vehicles moving along one of these lanes is invisible from more than 100 yards away. It is also trapped. If the enemy is waiting at the next intersection, there is nowhere to go. The American soldiers who push inland from Omaha and Utah beaches in the 2nd and 3rd weeks of June 1944 discover all of this firsthand. The planning documents they trained with said almost nothing about it. The sand tables and terrain models they studied in England showed the hedgerows as simple property boundaries, not defensive fortifications. Now they are standing in front of walls that their rifles cannot penetrate and their tanks cannot climb, and somewhere on the other side, in the next field over, German soldiers are digging in. The Germans understand this terrain. Many of the units defending Normandy in June 1944 are not elite formations. They are static divisions filled with older men, soldiers recovering from wounds, Ostbataillon, recruited from Soviet prisoners of war. But they do not need to be elite to use the bocage effectively. All a German squad needs is a machine gun, a clear field of fire, and patience. The Americans have to come through the hedgerow eventually. When they do, they will come through a gap and the gap can be covered. One machine gun, properly sighted, can hold a single field for hours. One anti-tank gun, dug in at the far corner where the hedgerows meet, can destroy every tank that tries to break through. The mathematics of the situation are brutal. There are thousands of these fields between the invasion beaches and the open country beyond the bocage. Each one has to be taken individually. The Germans can fall back from one field to the next, setting up in a new position, while the Americans are still clearing the last one. The advance that was supposed to sweep across Normandy in days is measured in these early weeks in hundreds of yards per hour, sometimes less. This is the problem that no one planned for. The Sherman tank is the backbone of American armoured strength in the European theatre. It is not the best tank in the world. Its crews know this. The German Panther outweighs it by nearly 10 tons, carries thicker armour, and mounts a 75mm gun with superior muzzle velocity that can penetrate the Sherman's frontal plate at ranges where the Sherman's own gun simply bounces off. The Tiger is worse, a 45-ton monster with armour so thick that American tankers have reported hitting it with multiple rounds and watching the shells deflect without visible effect. There are Sherman crews who have given their vehicles nicknames like Ronson, after the cigarette lighter advertised with the slogan "Lights first time, every time," because of how quickly the tank's gasoline engine and ammunition storage can turn a hit into a catastrophic fire. But the Sherman has one advantage that no German tank can match. There are a lot of them. American war production has reached levels that German industrial planners considered impossible. The factories in Detroit and elsewhere are turning out Shermans by the thousands, enough to replace losses, enough to equip new divisions, enough to keep pushing even when the casualty rates are appalling. The strategy, if it can be called that, is simple. There are always more tanks. In the bocage, this advantage means nothing. The problem is geometry. A Sherman tank attempting to climb over a hedgerow embankment does not go straight up and over. The embankment is too steep, the earth too soft. Instead, the tank's nose tilts upward as the tracks churn into the base of the wall, and for a long, terrible moment, sometimes 10 seconds, sometimes 15, the entire vehicle is tilted backward at a steep angle, with its front pointing at the sky and its belly armour facing directly forward. The belly armour is the Sherman's weakest point. On most production models, it is barely an inch thick, enough to protect against mines and small arms fire, but nothing against a dedicated anti-tank round. And during those 10 or 15 seconds when the tank is climbing the embankment, that belly armour is not facing the ground. It is facing the field beyond the hedgerow. It is facing directly toward wherever the German anti-tank gun is dug in. The Germans understand this geometry too. They sight their guns accordingly. When an American tank column reaches a hedgerow and the lead vehicle begins to climb, the German gunner waits. He waits until the tank's nose is fully elevated, until the belly armour is completely exposed, and then he fires. At close range, and in the bocage, the ranges are almost always close, the shot is nearly certain to penetrate, and when a round penetrates the belly armour of a Sherman tank, it enters the crew compartment directly. The ammunition stored along the hull walls can cook off in a chain reaction. The gasoline engine can ignite. The crew, if they are lucky, has a few seconds to bail out through the hatches before the whole vehicle becomes an inferno. If they are not lucky, they are still inside when it burns. The American commanders in Normandy are not fools, and they are not blind. They can see that the advance has stalled. They can read the casualty reports. They can count the burned-out Sherman hulks littering the hedgerow country, each one representing a crew that is dead or wounded or traumatized beyond immediate usefulness. They know that something has to change. The problem is figuring out what. The obvious solution, the engineer's solution, is to blow gaps in the hedgerows. Combat engineers attached to the infantry divisions try this in the first weeks after the landing. They approach an embankment under covering fire, bore holes into the base, pack the holes with explosive charges and detonate. The explosion tears a gap in the wall wide enough for a tank to drive through, but the explosion also tells the Germans exactly where the gap will be. The flash and smoke are visible for hundreds of yards. The sound carries even farther. By the time the dust settles and the tank begins to move forward, the German gunner in the next field has already traversed his weapon to cover the breach. The first tank through takes a hit. Sometimes the second tank through takes a hit too. The Americans are trading tanks and crews for yards of ground, and the exchange rate is unsustainable. Another solution, already in limited use, is the dozer tank. This is a standard Sherman fitted with a bulldozer blade on the front, allowing it to push earth and debris out of the way. In theory, a dozer tank can carve a path directly through a hedgerow without explosives, maintaining the element of surprise. In practice, the dozer tanks are enormous, obvious targets. Their blades add weight and reduce speed. Their profiles are distinctive even at long range. The German anti-tank crews learn to prioritize them. Kill the dozer, and the armoured column behind it stops. Kill enough dozers, and the Americans run out of them. There are not enough dozers to go around anyway. The army has a limited number of them in theatre. Every one that burns in a hedgerow assault is one that cannot be replaced immediately. The logistics chain stretches back across the Atlantic, and the ships carrying replacement equipment are also carrying ammunition, fuel, food, medicine, and the 1,000 other things an army needs to keep fighting. The dozers will come eventually, but eventually is not now, and now is when the advance has stalled. At higher headquarters, the generals are beginning to ask difficult questions. The Normandy landings were supposed to be the beginning of a rapid campaign to liberate France and drive into Germany before winter. The Allied timetable called for the capture of Cherbourg, a major port, within days of the initial assault. The city did not fall until June 27th, 3 weeks late, and the Germans demolished the port facilities so thoroughly that it would be months before the harbour could handle significant cargo traffic. The city of Caen, a key road junction that the British were supposed to take on D-Day itself, remains in German hands. The Allied beachhead is shallow, crowded, and vulnerable to counterattack. If the Germans can hold the line long enough for reinforcements to arrive, if they can turn Normandy into a static front like the trenches of the First World War, the entire invasion might fail. This is the context in which an ordinary sergeant from New Jersey begins to think about scrap metal. Curtis Grubb. Culin III is 29 years old in the summer of 1944. He was born in Cranford, New Jersey, a small commuter town about 15 miles southwest of Manhattan. His father, Curtis Grubb Culin Jr., was a veteran of the First World War who served with the American Expeditionary Forces in France. His mother was from a local family. He grew up in a town of tree-lined streets and modest houses, close enough to New York City that the glow of its lights was visible on the horizon at night, far enough that the rhythms of daily life still centered on church socials, high school football games, and the volunteer fire department. Before the war, Culin worked as a tool and die maker. This is a skilled trade, the kind of work that requires a deep practical understanding of metal, how it bends, how it breaks, how it can be shaped by heat and pressure, and cutting tools into precise forms. A good tool and die maker can look at a broken piece of machinery and visualize what it is supposed to be. He can fabricate replacement parts from raw stock when the original specifications have been lost. He understands tolerances, clearances, the way different alloys behave under stress. This is not theoretical knowledge learned from books. It is knowledge earned at a workbench, with a file in one hand and a micrometer in the other, making mistakes and fixing them until the work comes out right. Culin enlisted in the army after Pearl Harbor and was eventually assigned to the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, part of the 2nd Armoured Division. The reconnaissance squadrons are the eyes of the armoured force, pushing out ahead of the main tank columns to locate the enemy, report on terrain, and screen the flanks of the advance. Their vehicles are a mix of light tanks and armoured cars, faster and more nimble than the heavy Shermans, but also more vulnerable. Their crews are expected to be resourceful. When you are operating ahead of the main line, cut off from immediate support, you learn to improvise or you do not survive long. By early July 1944, Culin has been in Normandy for several weeks. He has seen the bocage. He has watched tanks die trying to cross it. He has heard the arguments about what to do, the debates about explosives, about dozers, about infantry tactics, about whether it is possible to simply go around the hedgerow belt entirely. None of the solutions seem to work. None of them address the fundamental problem, which is geometric. The tank has to cross the hedgerow, and when it does, it exposes its belly. The story of what happens next has been told in multiple accounts, and the details vary slightly depending on the source. But the core narrative, supported by military records and later interviews with surviving participants, goes something like this. It begins with a conversation, a bull session, the soldiers call it, A group of men talking during a lull in operations, complaining about the hedgerows, brainstorming ideas that range from the practical to the absurd. Someone mentions the dozer tanks and how they keep getting knocked out. Someone else suggests digging trenches under the hedgerows and driving through below ground level, which is logistically impossible, but at least demonstrates creative thinking. And then a soldier known to history only by his nickname, Roberts, makes a joke. Why don't we weld saw teeth onto the front of the tank and cut straight through? It is not a serious suggestion. Roberts, whoever he is, does not submit a formal proposal to the Army Ordnance Corps. He does not sketch a design or calculate load stresses. He is a soldier in a foxhole making a wisecrack to pass the time, the same way soldiers have made wisecracks in every war since the invention of war. The men around him laugh, or grunt, or say nothing, and the conversation moves on. But Culin is a tool and die maker from Cranford, New Jersey, and he does not stop thinking about it. The German beach obstacles are still piled along the shoreline. No one has cleaned them up yet. There has not been time. The invasion was barely 4 weeks ago, and every available soldier has been committed to the advance inland. The wrecked equipment from the landing, the disabled tanks, the sunken landing craft, the bodies that the tide keeps washing up, is being cleared gradually as labour becomes available, but the obstacles themselves are low priority. They served their purpose, or failed to serve their purpose, and now they are just metal. Scrap. Junk. Culin looks at them differently. The Czech hedgehogs were built from railway iron, heavy steel beams cut to length and welded together at angles. The welds are rough, made by German labour troops working under pressure to meet a deadline, but the steel itself is good. It has to be. The obstacles were designed to hold back several tons of landing craft driven by powerful engines. They were designed not to bend, not to break, not to collapse under impact. That same strength, Culin realises, could be repurposed. He does not have formal authorization to modify government property. The tanks he serves with belong to the United States Army, not to him, and there are regulations, extensive, detailed regulations, about what can and cannot be done to them. Welding unauthorized attachments to the hull of a tank is not, generally speaking, encouraged by the chain of command. It voids warranties, if tanks had warranties. It creates liability, if armies worried about liability. It is the kind of thing that gets soldiers yelled at by officers who believe that the correct response to any problem is to submit a requisition form and wait for the proper authorities to handle it. Culin does not submit a requisition form. Instead, he organises a work party. The men drag several Czech hedgehogs away from the beach and transport them to a rear area where the unit's maintenance section has set up shop. They have a cutting torch, they have a welding rig, they have the skills and the materials, and most importantly, they have the freedom that comes from operating in a combat zone, where the normal rules are suspended by the simple fact that people are dying every day, and anything that might make them stop dying is worth trying. The design they come up with is not complicated. It does not need to be. Culin takes 4 lengths of steel beam, cuts them to roughly the same size, and welds them to a horizontal crossbar that can be attached to the front hull of a Sherman tank. The beams angle downward and forward like the tines of a fork or the tusks of an animal. The bottom edges are sharpened not to a fine point, but enough to bite into earth. The whole assembly is heavy, several hundred pounds, but a Sherman can carry the extra weight without difficulty. The question is whether it will actually work. The engineering logic is simple. When a Sherman tank approaches a hedgerow without the device, its rounded front hull makes contact with the embankment and begins to ride up, tilting the tank backward and exposing its belly. But with the steel prongs mounted to the front, the contact point changes. The prongs dig into the base of the hedgerow before the hull can begin to climb. They anchor the tank holding its nose down, and as the driver applies power, the prongs act as a cutting edge, tearing into the wall of roots and compacted earth. Instead of climbing over the hedgerow, the tank ploughs through it. That is the theory anyway. Theories are easy. The hard part is testing. The first trial run takes place somewhere in the Norman countryside, probably in late June or early July 1944. The historical record does not preserve the exact date or location. What it preserves is the result. The tank, a Sherman fitted with Culin's improvised steel prongs, lines up facing a hedgerow embankment. The driver guns the engine. The tracks churn. And instead of tilting backward, exposing its belly to an imaginary German gunner, the tank goes straight forward, nose level, the prongs biting into the hedgerow's base and tearing a path through it like a knife through stale bread. The dirt explodes outward. Roots snap. The ancient embankment shaped by centuries of Norman farmers, parts before a weapon that was invented a few days ago by an enlisted man with a welding torch and no formal engineering training. It works. Word travels fast in an army. The soldiers who witness the first test tell other soldiers, who tell their sergeants, who tell their lieutenants, who eventually tell someone with enough rank to make a decision. Within days, the improvised hedgerow cutter, not yet called the Rhino, not yet famous, has come to the attention of officers several levels above Culin's pay grade. A formal demonstration is arranged. The audience for this demonstration includes Lieutenant General Omar N. Bradley, commanding the 1st United States Army. Bradley is one of the most important American generals in the European theatre. He was born in Missouri, graduated from West Point in the same class as Dwight Eisenhower, and rose through the interwar army in a series of staff and training assignments that did not seem, at the time, to be preparing him for anything particularly historic. He commanded a division in North Africa and Sicily, then a corps, then an army. He's soft-spoken, bespectacled, and unassuming in manner, a striking contrast to the flamboyant George Patton, his sometime rival and subordinate. But he is also a careful student of ground combat, and a general who pays attention to what his troops are experiencing at the front. Bradley has been worrying about the bocage. He knows the casualty figures. He knows the advance has slowed to a crawl. He knows that somewhere in the near future he will be asked to launch a major offensive, what will eventually become Operation Cobra, and that the success of that offensive depends on the tanks being able to move. If the hedgerows cannot be crossed, the offensive cannot succeed. If the offensive does not succeed, the entire Normandy campaign could stagnate into a grinding attrition fight that the Allies can win eventually, with enough blood and time, but not on any schedule that the strategic planners in London and Washington would consider acceptable. So when word reaches him that some enlisted man in a cavalry reconnaissance squadron has invented a gadget that might solve the hedgerow problem, Bradley decides to see it for himself. The demonstration takes place on July 14th, 1944, Bastille Day, although the irony is probably lost on most of the Americans present. A Sherman tank fitted with Culin's steel prongs takes its position facing a hedgerow. Bradley and his staff officers watch. The driver engages the clutch. What happens next? Bradley will later describe in his memoir, A Soldier's Story, published in 1951. He watches the tank surge forward, he watches the prongs bite into the embankment, and he watches the hedgerow, the same kind of hedgerow that has been stopping his army for weeks, explode outward in a shower of dirt and roots and debris as the Sherman punches straight through it like a charging rhinoceros. Bradley is not a man given to theatrical displays of emotion, but according to the accounts of those present, his reaction is immediate. He turns to his staff. He gives the order: fabricate as many of these devices as possible, as quickly as possible, and fit them to every tank in the First Army that can carry one. The breakout from Normandy is coming, and now, for the first time since the landings, Omar Bradley believes it might actually work. The name comes almost immediately. Someone, no one remembers who, looks at a Sherman tank fitted with Culin's steel prongs and sees the resemblance to a charging animal, head lowered, horn thrust forward, ready to gore whatever stands in its path. Rhinoceros. Rhino. The nickname sticks. Within days, every tank in the First Army equipped with the device is a Rhino tank, and every tanker who climbs into one knows exactly what the name means. They are not prey anymore, they are predators. The fabrication effort begins at once. Ordnance units across the First Army receive orders to begin producing the devices. The specifications are simple: 4 steel prongs, a crossbar, mounting brackets for the tank's front hull. But the scale of the undertaking is enormous. Bradley wants as many rhinos as possible, as fast as possible, and he is willing to divert significant resources to make it happen. Work parties return to the invasion beaches and begin salvaging every piece of German steel they can find. The Czech hedgehogs planted by the Wehrmacht to gut American landing craft are cut apart and reforged into weapons that will be used to gut German defensive positions. There is a poetic justice to this that the soldiers appreciate. The work continues around the clock. Welders who have not slept in days keep working, fueled by coffee and cigarettes and the knowledge that every rhino they finish is another tank that might survive the next assault. By the time Operation Cobra launches on July 25, 1944, 11 days after Bradley's demonstration, roughly 3 out of every 5 tanks in the First Army have been converted to Rhinos. The estimates vary by source, but the total number produced by American ordnance units is approximately 500. The British, watching the American work with interest, begin manufacturing their own version. They call it the prong, a less dramatic name but an accurate one, and they fit it to their Shermans, their Cromwells, and their tank destroyers. By the end of the Normandy campaign, British forces will have produced over 2,000 prongs, more than 4 times the American total. The device that was invented by a sergeant with no formal authorization, using scrap metal salvaged from enemy defences, has become standard equipment for the Allied armoured forces in France. Curtis Culin III does not take sole credit for the invention. This is one of the details that often gets lost in the telling. The newspaper articles that will eventually be written about the Rhino tank, the headlines in Cullin's hometown paper, the stories picked up by wire services across the country, will call him the inventor, the hero, the man who saved the Normandy campaign. And in a narrow technical sense, this is accurate. Culin was the one who organised the work party, who supervised the fabrication, who oversaw the first tests. His hands were on the tools, his name went on the reports that eventually reached Bradley's headquarters. But Culin himself, in the accounts that survive, consistently tries to share the credit with Roberts. The problem is that no one seems to know who Roberts actually is. He appears in the historical record only as a nickname, Roberts, sometimes a fellow soldier named Roberts, attached to the offhand comment that supposedly inspired the whole project. The joke about welding saw teeth onto a tank, the throwaway remark that Culin, unlike everyone else who heard it, took seriously enough to actually try. Military historians have attempted to identify Roberts without success. The 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron's personnel records from this period are incomplete. Many of the men who served in the unit during the Normandy campaign were killed, wounded, or transferred to other units before anyone thought to ask them about a conversation that happened in a foxhole in June 1944. Roberts, if that was his real name, and not itself a nickname, vanishes into the fog of war. This is how history works sometimes. The person who has the original idea is not always the person who gets the credit. The spark and the fire are not the same thing. Culin had the skills, the resources, and the determination to turn a joke into a working piece of military equipment. Roberts had the imagination to see the problem from a different angle, to suggest a solution that everyone else dismissed as absurd. Both contributions mattered. Only one of them made it into the history books. Culin, to his credit, never stopped trying to correct the record. In interviews conducted after the war, he repeatedly emphasized that the idea had not been his alone, that Roberts deserved recognition, that the Rhino tank was the product of collective effort and not individual genius. But by then, the story had taken on a life of its own. The newspapers wanted a hero, a single name to attach to the invention, and Culin was the name they had. Roberts remained a footnote, mentioned in passing, if mentioned at all, and then forgotten. The Rhino tanks go into action for the first time during Operation Cobra. The offensive begins on July 25, 1944, 11 days after Bradley's demonstration. It is preceded by one of the most intensive air bombardments of the entire war, over 2,000 American aircraft dropping thousands of tons of high explosive onto a narrow strip of German defensive positions south of the town of St. Lo. The bombardment is supposed to shatter the German lines, opening a gap for the armoured columns to exploit. In practice, some of the bombs fall short, killing over 100 American soldiers, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer to die in the European theatre. The carnage on the American side is severe enough that Bradley briefly considers calling off the attack. He does not call it off. The tanks roll forward, and now, for the first time, they do not stop at the hedgerows. The Rhino tanks hit the embankments at speed, prongs biting into earth, dirt and roots spraying outward as the Shermans bore straight through obstacles that had stopped them cold for 6 weeks. The German defenders, dug in behind the hedgerows with their anti-tank guns carefully sighted to cover the gaps, suddenly find themselves facing attacks from directions they did not expect. The Rhinos do not use the gaps, they make their own gaps. They tear through the ancient Norman embankments like the walls are made of paper, and the defensive geometry that had favoured the Germans since D-Day collapses in a matter of hours. By nightfall on July 25th, American units have advanced further than they did in the entire month of July up to that point. By July 27th, the German defensive line in Normandy is visibly cracking. By August 1st, the First Army has broken out of the bocage entirely, and the race across France, the pursuit that will not end until the Allies reach the German frontier, has begun. The question of how much credit the Rhino tanks deserve for the Cobra breakthrough is more complicated than the heroic narratives suggest. Military historians who have studied the operation in detail point out that the carpet bombing preceding the offensive, despite its tragic friendly fire incidents, devastated the German units in the attack zone. Some divisions lost more than half their effective strength before a single American tank crossed the line of departure. The survivors were dazed, demoralized, and in many cases unable to coordinate an effective defense. The Rhino tanks made it easier to exploit this disarray, but they were not the only factor, perhaps not even the primary factor, in the breakthrough's success. There is also the question of German reinforcements. By late July, the Wehrmacht had committed nearly every available unit in France to holding the Normandy perimeter. There were no significant reserves left to plug gaps or counterattack penetrations. When the American armour broke through, there was simply nothing behind the front line to stop it. The Rhinos helped the tanks get through the hedgerows faster, but once through they were racing across open country against an enemy that had nothing left to throw in their way. And yet, the testimonies of the soldiers who were there, the tankers, the infantry, the combat engineers who had spent 6 weeks watching men die against the hedgerows, are remarkably consistent. The Rhino tanks changed everything. They changed the mathematics of hedgerow assault. They changed the morale of crews who no longer had to expose their bellies every time they crossed a field boundary. They changed the psychological balance between attacker and defender, giving the Americans an advantage they had not possessed since the first days of the invasion. Whether the Rhinos won the Battle of Normandy is a question for academic historians to debate. What is certain is that the men who used them believed they made a difference. And in war, belief matters. An army that believes it can win fights differently than an army that believes it is trapped. The Rhino tanks helped the American army in Normandy believe it could win. The sun is setting over the Norman countryside, and somewhere in a field that was German-held territory this morning and is American-held territory now, a Sherman tank sits with its engine cooling. The crew climbs out through the hatches. They are dirty, exhausted, half deaf from the noise of the gun firing, but they are alive, all of them. The tank carried them through 3 hedgerow assaults today, the steel prongs biting into each embankment, the machine pushing through walls that would have killed them a month ago. They pat the hull like you would pat a horse that carried you through a hard ride. They do not know the name of the sergeant who invented the device welded to their tank's front. They do not know about Roberts, about the joke in the foxhole, about the work party salvaging German beach obstacles from the Normandy sand. They know only that something changed. They know that the war feels different now than it did a week ago. They know that tomorrow they will climb back into the tank and push forward again, further into France, toward the German frontier and whatever lies beyond it. They know that they might actually make it. The war feels different now, and somewhere in England, in the vast organisational apparatus that churns behind every combat operation, the paperwork is catching up to the reality. In the first weeks of August 1944, Curtis Culin III exists in an unusual administrative limbo. He is still a sergeant in the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, still drawing the same pay, still sleeping in the same bivouac areas as the men he has served with since the division shipped overseas, but his name is now moving through channels that have nothing to do with reconnaissance patrols or tank maintenance schedules. Staff officers in rear echelon headquarters are drafting citations. Public affairs personnel are compiling background information. The machinery of military recognition, once set in motion, operates with its own momentum, and Culin, who by all accounts wanted nothing more than to solve a tactical problem and keep his fellow soldiers alive, is about to become something he never sought to be: a symbol. The timeline of what happens next can be reconstructed from military records, newspaper archives, and the recollections of officers who were present during those weeks. Sometime in mid-July, shortly after General Bradley witnessed the demonstration that convinced him to order mass production of the Hedgerow Cutter, someone in the First Army's chain of command began the process of recommending Culin for formal recognition. The recommendation travelled upward through division, corps and army headquarters, accumulating endorsements at each level. By the time the paperwork reached its final destination, the recommendation had been upgraded to one of the highest honours the Army could bestow on an enlisted man for meritorious service, the Legion of Merit. The award would eventually be presented to Culin personally by General Bradley, a detail that speaks to how seriously the senior command viewed the contribution. Bradley was not in the habit of presenting decorations to individual sergeants. His schedule was consumed by the operational demands of commanding an army group in the most intensive campaign of the war. But the Rhino tank had made an impression on him that went beyond ordinary tactical innovation. In his memoir, written years after the war, Bradley would describe the Hedgerow Cutter as the solution to a problem that had genuinely worried him, a problem his own staff had failed to solve despite weeks of effort. The fact that the solution came from a sergeant with a welding torch, rather than from the Army's vast research and development apparatus was, for Bradley, both humbling and instructive. The public affairs operation that accompanied the award was, by the standards of wartime, remarkably efficient. Within weeks of the Cobra breakthrough, Cullin's story was being prepared for release to the American press. The narrative that emerged was straightforward, compelling, and almost entirely focused on Culin himself. A young sergeant from New Jersey, using captured German equipment to solve a problem that had stumped the Army's best minds, enabling the breakout that liberated France. It was the kind of story that wartime America was hungry for. Evidence that the ordinary citizen soldier, the man who'd been a factory worker or a clerk or a student before the war, could match and exceed the ingenuity of professional military planners when circumstances demanded it. What the narrative did not include, at least not prominently, was any mention of Roberts. The historical record on this point is fragmentary, but suggestive. Culin himself, according to multiple sources, consistently tried to share credit for the invention. He told interviewers that the original idea had come from another soldier, a man he referred to as Roberts, who had made an offhand remark during a conversation about the hedgerow problem. The remark, something along the lines of welding teeth onto the front of a tank and sawing through the hedgerows, had struck Culin as worth pursuing. He was the one who organised the work party, supervised the fabrication, and advocated for testing the device in front of increasingly senior officers. But the spark, the initial concept, had come from someone else. Who was Roberts? The historical record offers frustratingly little. No first name appears in any of the contemporary accounts. No rank beyond the implication that he was an enlisted man. No unit assignment, no hometown, no photograph. In the chaos of a combat zone where men came and went constantly, transferred, wounded, killed, reassigned, keeping track of a single soldier whose contribution was a throwaway joke in a foxhole conversation was apparently beyond the capacity of the record-keeping systems available. Roberts, whoever he was, slipped through the cracks of history at precisely the moment when history was taking notice of the idea he had sparked. There are several possible explanations for this disappearance. Roberts may have been killed in action before the Rhino tank gained widespread attention. Casualties in the hedgerow fighting were severe, and a soldier who made a casual remark in mid-June might easily have been dead by mid-July. He may have been wounded and evacuated, his name lost in the administrative shuffle of field hospitals and replacement depots. He may have been transferred to another unit, his connection to the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron severed before anyone thought to record his role. Or he may simply have been present throughout the entire sequence of events, watching the invention he had inadvertently inspired become famous, and for reasons of his own choosing not to step forward and claim credit. The last possibility is perhaps the most intriguing. Military culture, particularly among enlisted men in combat units, has its own codes of behaviour, its own hierarchies of respect and deference that do not always align with the formal rank structure. A soldier who made a joke that someone else took seriously and developed into a working invention might feel that claiming credit for the joke was somehow inappropriate, that the real work, the real contribution, had been Culin's. He might have felt that stepping forward would seem like an attempt to steal glory from a man who had earned it. Or he might simply have been the kind of person who preferred to remain anonymous, uncomfortable with the attention and publicity that would come from being identified as the co-inventor of a device that was changing the course of a major military campaign. Whatever the reason, Roberts remained a shadow figure while Culin became a public face of American ingenuity at war. The publicity reached Cranford, New Jersey in September 1944, when the Cranford Citizen and Chronicle ran a story on its local hero. The newspaper article, preserved in historical archives, presents Culin as the town had known him before the war, a young man from a respectable family, educated at local schools, unremarkable in any particular way until the circumstances of combat revealed capabilities that peacetime had never called upon. The tone of the coverage is celebratory but restrained, consistent with the journalistic conventions of the era. There are no interviews with Culin himself, he was still in France, still fighting, but there are quotes from family members and acquaintances, expressions of pride and satisfaction that one of Cranford's own had made such a notable contribution to the war effort. What the newspaper coverage reveals, perhaps unintentionally, is the gap between the public narrative and the reality of combat engineering. The stories describe the Rhino tank as a brilliant invention, a stroke of genius that solved an intractable problem. They do not describe the hours of trial and error, the failed prototypes, the difficulty of welding salvaged steel to tank hulls in field conditions. They do not describe the danger of testing an unproven device in an active combat zone, where a design flaw could get the test crew killed. They do not describe the skepticism that Culin and his colleagues initially faced from officers who were not convinced that an enlisted man's improvisation deserved their attention. The journey from Roberts's joke to Bradley's demonstration had been neither simple nor certain. Culin had to persuade his immediate superiors to let him try the experiment in the first place. He had to scrounge materials in a combat zone where supplies were rationed and accounted for. He had to convince a tank crew to risk their lives testing a device that had never been used before, in a tactical situation where failure meant death. At each step, the project could have died, killed by skepticism, by lack of resources, by the simple bad luck of a German artillery shell landing in the wrong place at the wrong time. That it did not die, that it instead succeeded and proliferated across the entire First Army within a matter of weeks, speaks to something beyond mere mechanical ingenuity. It speaks to Culin's ability to advocate for his invention, to navigate the informal hierarchies of military decision-making, to find the right people to impress at the right moments. The sergeant from Cranford was not just a fabricator, he was also, whether he recognized it or not, a persuader. The speed of the Rhino's adoption remains one of the more remarkable features of the story. In any large bureaucratic organization, particularly a military one operating under the pressures of active combat, introducing new equipment is typically a slow and cumbersome process. There are testing protocols, safety certifications, manufacturing specifications, supply chain logistics, training requirements. A new piece of equipment developed through normal channels might take months or years to reach frontline units, as each step of the approval process adds its own delays and complications. The Rhino tank bypassed all of this. From the first successful field test to mass deployment across the First Army took at most 2 weeks. Ordnance crews worked around the clock, fabricating the steel prongs from whatever materials were available, mostly the same captured German beach obstacles that Culin had originally used. The prongs were welded to tank hulls in field workshops, with no formal blueprints, no standardized specifications, no quality control beyond the judgment of the welders themselves. Training for the tank crews consisted largely of watching other crews use the devices and then trying it themselves. The entire process was, by peacetime standards, chaotic and improvised. But it worked. It worked because the need was urgent, the design was simple, and the results were immediately visible. A tank fitted with Rhino prongs could do something that a tank without them could not: push through a hedgerow without exposing its belly to German fire. The demonstration was so clear, so unambiguous, that the usual bureaucratic cautions fell away. Commanders who might otherwise have insisted on proper procedures looked at the tactical situation, looked at the casualty rates in the hedgerow fighting, and made a decision: get these things on the tanks now, and figure out the paperwork later. The British response to the American innovation illustrates both the strengths and the limitations of this improvised approach. British armoured units, operating alongside the Americans in Normandy, faced the same hedgerow problem and had developed their own solutions, mostly variations on explosive charges and bulldozer attachments, similar to what the Americans had tried before Culin's invention. When word of the Rhino tanks reached British headquarters, there was immediate interest. British engineers examined captured American-fitted Shermans and quickly understood the design principles involved. The British version, which they called the prong, was essentially a copy of Culin's original concept, adapted to fit British tank models including the Cromwell and various tank destroyers. British manufacturing capacity. operating under slightly different constraints than the American field workshops, eventually produced over 2,000 units, significantly more than the American total. The design was simple enough that mass production was straightforward once the concept was understood, yet the British adoption also highlighted a subtle difference in military culture. Where the American Rhinos had been improvised in the field by enlisted men working without formal authorization, the British prongs were manufactured through more conventional channels, with proper specifications and quality controls. The British approach was arguably more systematic, but it was also slower. British units were still receiving their prongs well after the Cobra breakout had already occurred. The American willingness to bypass normal procedures had given them a tactical advantage measured in days, and in the fluid circumstances of the Normandy campaign, days mattered. The organisational lesson embedded in this story would not be lost on military planners in the decades to come. The Rhino tank became a case study in what later generations would call battlefield innovation, the ability of frontline units to identify problems and develop solutions faster than the formal research and development apparatus could respond. The Army's official history of the Normandy campaign would cite the Hedgerow Cutter as an example of how combat necessity could drive improvisation that no amount of pre-war planning had anticipated. But there was also a darker lesson, one that military reformers would spend years trying to address. If a sergeant with a welding torch could solve a problem in days that the Army's planning staff had failed to solve in weeks, what did that say about the Army's institutional capacity for innovation? Why had no one in the vast apparatus of Army Ordnance, Army Ground Forces, or the Armoured Forces' own development centres anticipated the hedgerow problem and designed a solution before the invasion? The Wehrmacht had placed Czech hedgehogs on the beaches specifically to obstruct the Allied landings. Why had no American planner looked at aerial photographs of the Norman bocage and asked what those tank trap obstacles would look like if someone welded them to the front of a Sherman? The answers to these questions are embedded in the structure of military bureaucracies themselves. Pre-invasion planning for Operation Overlord was conducted under conditions of extreme secrecy, with different planning cells working on different aspects of the operation and limited communication between them. The officers responsible for assessing terrain knew about the hedgerows, but may not have fully understood their tactical implications for armoured warfare. The officers responsible for tank development were focused on main gun performance, armour thickness, and engine reliability. The specifications that had been identified as critical in previous campaigns in North Africa and Sicily. No one owned the problem of bocage warfare until the invasion happened and the problem announced itself in the form of burning tanks and dead crews. Culin was able to solve the problem precisely because he was not part of any formal planning structure. He was a tank crewman who had seen the hedgerows from ground level, who understood exactly how they threatened his own survival, and who had the mechanical skills and initiative to try something. He did not have to coordinate with other planning cells or seek approval from distant headquarters. He just welded some steel to a tank and tried it. The war, meanwhile, continued to move. By the time the publicity machine had fully processed Culin's story, the fighting had moved far beyond the hedgerows of Normandy. American and British forces were racing across France, liberating Paris in late August, pushing toward the German frontier. The desperate struggle in the bocage was already beginning to fade into memory, replaced by the heady days of pursuit warfare across open country, when it seemed for a time that the war in Europe might be over by Christmas. Culin continued to serve with his unit through these weeks, though the exact details of his subsequent combat service are less well documented than the Hedgerow Cutter story that made him famous. He was still a sergeant, still performing the duties of a reconnaissance soldier in a mechanised cavalry squadron, still subject to all the dangers and discomforts of frontline service. The Legion of Merit citation and the newspaper coverage existed somewhere in the administrative realm, following him like a paper shadow, but in the immediate reality of the European campaign, he was simply another soldier doing his job. The contrast between Culin's public image and his private experience during these months is worth considering. To the American home front, he was an inventor hero, proof that American ingenuity could triumph over German military engineering. To the men in his unit, he was Kurt Culin, the sergeant who had come up with that hedgerow gadget and gotten famous for it. To Culin himself, if later accounts of his temperament are accurate, the attention was more burden than blessing. He was not a man who sought the spotlight. He had solved a problem because the problem needed solving, not because he wanted recognition. The fact that recognition came anyway, and came in forms that he could not control, seems to have been a source of some discomfort. And always, in the background, there was Roberts, the unnamed soldier whose joke had started everything. The man who had vanished from the story at the moment the story became famous. Culin kept mentioning him in interviews, kept trying to redirect credit, but the narrative machinery had already locked into place. The story of one inventor hero was simpler, more compelling, more useful for propaganda purposes than the story of two soldiers, one of whom was now untraceable. Roberts, if he was still alive, remained in the shadows. His contribution, the spark that ignited the fire, would be relegated to footnotes and parenthetical asides in the historical accounts that followed. The autumn of 1944 brought new challenges and new horrors. The pursuit across France slowed as supply lines stretched thin, and German resistance stiffened near the frontier. The hedgerow cutter, so essential in July, was now largely irrelevant. The terrain of eastern France and the German borderlands presented different obstacles requiring different solutions. The Rhino prongs remained welded to the tanks that carried them, vestiges of a battle that was already history, but the crews who used them were now facing new problems: mud, cold, and a German army that was far from beaten. In the fields where the hedgerow fighting had occurred, the scars were already beginning to heal. Norman farmers, emerging from cellars and refuges where they had sheltered during the worst of the combat, surveyed the damage to their ancient boundaries and began the slow process of repair. The embankments that had cost so many lives would be rebuilt over the coming years, the craters filled in, the burned-out tanks hauled away for scrap. Within a generation, the bocage would look much as it had before the invasion, a landscape of small fields and dense hedgerows, peaceful and pastoral, its brief role as a killing ground preserved only in monuments, cemeteries, and the memories of those who had fought there. But that healing lay in the future. In the autumn of 1944, the war still had months to run, and the men who had survived the hedgerows still had far to go before they would see home again. The winter came early that year, or so it seemed to the soldiers who had spent the summer fighting in Normandy's green fields, and were now shivering in foxholes along the German frontier. By December, the First Army had pushed deep into the Ardennes, a forested highland region straddling the borders of Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. Terrain that military planners considered quiet, a place to rest weary divisions and integrate new replacements. The hedgerows of Normandy felt like ancient history now, a problem from another season, another phase of the war. The Rhino prongs on surviving Shermans had accumulated rust where the welds met the hull, relics of a tactical emergency that no longer applied. Curtis Culin was still with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, still performing the dangerous work of probing enemy positions and gathering intelligence for the larger formations moving behind. Reconnaissance units operated at the sharp edge of uncertainty, often the first Americans to encounter German forces in a given sector, frequently outgunned and relying on speed and radio communication rather than firepower. It was not glamorous duty. It was the kind of work where men died in twos and threes, in ambushes and sudden firefights, far from the massed tank battles that dominated newsreel coverage. The Reconnaissance Troopers' War was intimate and lethal, fought at close range in half-seen glimpses through forest and fog. On December 16, 1944, that quiet sector erupted. 3 German army groups, over 200,000 men, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, launched a massive offensive through the Ardennes, aiming to split the Allied armies in two and recapture the vital port of Antwerp. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. American units holding the front were overwhelmed, scattered, destroyed in detail. Within days, a bulge 50 miles deep had been punched into the Allied lines, giving the battle its eventual name. The 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, positioned in the path of the German advance, found itself fighting for survival in conditions that bore no resemblance to the bocage. Dense pine forests, freezing temperatures, roads choked with snow and fleeing refugees, communication networks shattered, supply lines cut. The details of Culin's service during the Battle of the Bulge are fragmentary. Military records from the chaotic early days of the German offensive are incomplete, and the reconnaissance squadron's operational reports from this period contain gaps where documents were lost or never filed. What is known is that the 102nd was engaged, that it took casualties, and that its surviving members eventually regrouped as the German offensive stalled and reversed. Whether Culin personally saw combat during the worst of the fighting, whether he was wounded, whether he distinguished himself in any particular action. These specifics have not been preserved in the historical record with the same clarity as the Hedgerow Cutter story. He was there. He survived. Beyond that, the details blur into the larger narrative of the division's experience. This gap in the record is itself revealing. The Battle of the Bulge produced its own set of heroes, its own dramatic narratives. The surrounded paratroopers at Bastogne, the desperate defence of Saint-Vite, the tank commanders who held crossroads against overwhelming odds. Culin's earlier fame did not automatically translate into continued prominence. The Army's public relations apparatus, which had so eagerly promoted the Hedgerow Cutter story in the summer, was now focused on new crises and new protagonists. The newspapers that had celebrated Culin in September were now printing maps showing the alarming depth of the German penetration and profiles of the commanders racing to contain it. One sergeant's invention, however valuable it had been 6 months earlier, was old news. By late January 1945, the Bulge had been eliminated. The German forces pushed back to their starting positions and beyond, their last major offensive capability in the West exhausted. The cost had been staggering. Over 80,000 American casualties, the bloodiest single battle the United States Army would fight in the entire war. Among the survivors, there was a grim understanding that the final defeat of Germany would require months more of hard fighting. The euphoric predictions of victory by Christmas had given way to a more sober assessment. The enemy was beaten, but not yet destroyed. The killing would continue until the Nazi regime collapsed entirely. The 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron advanced into Germany with the rest of the Allied forces during the spring of 1945, crossing the Rhine, probing into the industrial heartland, witnessing scenes of devastation that exceeded anything they had encountered in France. Bombed cities reduced to rubble, columns of displaced persons, slave labourers, concentration camp survivors, prisoners of war, streaming along the roads, German soldiers surrendering in masses, their units disintegrating, their will to fight exhausted. And then, on May 8th, the unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. For millions of American soldiers, the end of the war meant the beginning of a long wait for transportation home. The Army operated on a point system, calculating each soldier's eligibility for discharge based on length of service, time overseas, combat decorations, and other factors. Men with enough points were processed out relatively quickly. Those with fewer points faced extended periods of occupation duty, waiting in camps and requisitioned buildings across Germany, while the vast logistical machinery of demobilization slowly ground forward. The precise timing of Culin's return to the United States is not recorded in readily available sources, but it almost certainly occurred within the general wave of homecomings that took place between the summer of 1945 and the spring of 1946. Cranford, New Jersey, was much as he had left it, a commuter town of tree-lined streets and modest homes, 18 miles from Manhattan, population around 14,000. The wartime boom had brought full employment to the factories and shipyards of the metropolitan area, and the town's residents had done their part for the war effort through bond drives, scrap collection, and rationing compliance. Now the men were coming home, and the community was preparing to welcome them. Culin's return would have been noted in the local newspaper, the same Cranford Citizen and Chronicle that had celebrated his invention the previous autumn. A hero was back among them. But what did that heroism mean, now that the context that had produced it was fading into memory? The Hedgerow Cutter had been a response to a specific tactical problem in a specific landscape at a specific moment in the war. That moment was now history. The tanks fitted with Rhino prongs had been shipped home for storage or scrapped for metal. The bocage itself was being restored by Norman farmers who wanted nothing more than to forget the summer when their fields had become battlegrounds. The newspapers had moved on to new stories: the atomic bombs, the occupation of Japan, the emerging tensions with the Soviet Union, the domestic challenges of reconversion. Culin's 15 minutes of fame had come and gone. What he did with the rest of his life is less well documented than what he did in July 1944. The biographical sources available are sparse on details of his post-war career and personal circumstances. He had served his country, received a medal and a moment of public recognition, and then returned to civilian life like millions of others. The narrative machinery that had briefly made him a symbol of American ingenuity released its grip and moved on to other subjects. He became once again a private citizen, his name familiar only to those who remembered the wartime coverage or who encountered the Hedgerow Cutter story in subsequent military histories. This trajectory, from obscurity to brief celebrity and back to obscurity, was not unique to Culin. The Second World War produced countless examples of ordinary men who performed extraordinary acts, received their moment of recognition, and then disappeared back into the anonymous mass of returning veterans. The war's scale was simply too vast, its cast of characters too numerous, for any individual story to remain in the public consciousness for long. Only a handful of figures, generals, presidents, a few iconic heroes whose stories were deemed particularly compelling, retained lasting fame. The rest became footnotes, their contributions remembered mainly by specialists and enthusiasts. What sets Culin apart from most of these forgotten figures is the persistent documented trace of his concern for Roberts. In interview after interview, in every opportunity he had to shape the narrative, he returned to the same point. He was not the inventor. He was the fabricator, the builder, the man who had taken someone else's idea and made it work. The real credit belonged to the soldier who had cracked the joke about sawteeth, the spark that had ignited the entire sequence of events. That soldier's identity remained unknown, his contribution unrecognized, and this injustice, for Culin seems to have experienced it as an injustice, weighed on him. The historical record offers no resolution to this mystery. Military historians who have examined the Hedgerow Cutter story have generally concluded that Roberts was probably a real person, that Culin had no obvious motive to invent him, and that his consistent attribution of the original idea to this unnamed soldier should be taken seriously. But the identification has never been confirmed. No one named Roberts from the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron has been definitively linked to the joke that started everything. The Army's records from that period do not preserve informal conversations between enlisted men. The witnesses who might have corroborated Cullin's account, the other soldiers present when Roberts made his suggestion, either did not come forward, did not remember the incident clearly, or could not be located by the journalists and historians who later investigated. Roberts remains a ghost in the story, present only through Culin's insistence that he existed. This absence has troubled some historians, who have noted that the Roberts attribution appears nowhere in the earliest accounts of the Hedgerow Cutter's development. The contemporary newspaper coverage from September 1944 focuses almost exclusively on Culin. Roberts is either not mentioned at all or relegated to the vaguest possible references. It was only in later years, as Culin had more opportunities to tell his story, and more control over how it was framed, that the Roberts detail became a consistent element of the narrative. Some have suggested that Cullin's later emphasis on Roberts might reflect a psychological need to deflect credit, a manifestation of survivors' guilt or discomfort with fame, rather than an accurate memory of how the invention actually originated. But this interpretation has its own problems. Culin had nothing to gain and something to lose by crediting Roberts. The Legion of Merit was his, the newspaper coverage was his, the place in military history was his. By insisting that the idea had come from someone else, he was actively undermining his own claim to the invention, a claim that the army, the press, and the public had already accepted and celebrated. If he had simply remained silent about Roberts, no one would have questioned his status as the inventor. The fact that he kept bringing it up, kept redirecting credit, suggests that the attribution was genuine rather than performative. He was telling the truth as he remembered it, even though no one particularly wanted to hear it. The question of Roberts leads to a broader consideration of how military innovations actually happen, and how the stories we tell about them tend to simplify complex collaborative processes into neat narratives of individual genius. The Hedgerow Cutter did not emerge fully formed from a single mind. It was the product of a problem-solving environment in which many soldiers were thinking about the same challenge, trying different approaches, sharing ideas informally across units and ranks. Roberts' joke was part of that environment. Cullin's mechanical skills and willingness to act were part of it. The availability of German beach obstacles as raw material was part of it. The culture of improvisation that characterized American military operations, a culture in which enlisted men felt empowered to modify equipment and experiment with solutions without waiting for official approval, was part of it. Any complete account of the Hedgerow Cutter's origins would need to acknowledge all of these factors, and would need to resist the temptation to reduce the story to a single hero. But complete accounts are rarely what the public wants. The newspapers in 1944 needed a name and a face to attach to the invention. They found it in Culin. The Army's public relations apparatus needed a symbol of American ingenuity. Culin fit the role. The narrative of the lone inventor solving problems through native cleverness and practical skill resonated with deeply held American values about individualism and self-reliance. Roberts, whoever he was, did not fit this narrative. He was surplus to requirements, and so he was forgotten, even as the man who credited him kept trying to pull him back into the light. The post-war decades brought periodic revivals of interest in the Hedgerow Cutter story, as military historians and documentary filmmakers returned to the Normandy campaign and its many subsidiary narratives. The anniversary commemorations, the 10th, the 20th, the 50th, each generated a fresh wave of retrospectives and reassessments. The D-Day landings had become the centerpiece of American collective memory of the Second World War, the moment that defined the greatest generation's contribution to the defeat of fascism. Everything connected to that moment acquired a reflected glow of historical significance. Within this larger commemorative enterprise, the Hedgerow Cutter occupied a modest but stable place. It was not one of the headline stories, not the assault on the beaches, not the airborne drops behind enemy lines, not the breakout at St. Lo, but it was a good supporting anecdote, a concrete example of the American talent for improvisation that complemented the larger narrative of industrial might and strategic planning. Whenever a historian or journalist needed to illustrate the theme of enlisted man ingenuity, Cullin's invention was ready to hand. His name appeared in footnotes, in parenthetical asides, in the second or third paragraph of features about overlooked aspects of the Normandy campaign. This pattern of modest recurring attention continued through the second half of the 20th century. Culin himself aged, as all the veterans of that war aged, moving from young manhood through middle age and into old age, the weight of years accumulating, the events of 1944 receding further and further into the past. What he made of this periodic rediscovery of his moment of fame, whether he welcomed it, resented it, or simply accepted it with resignation, the sources do not say. The interviews from his later years, if they exist, have not been widely circulated. His voice grows fainter as the decades pass, replaced by the voices of historians and filmmakers speaking about him rather than to him. What we are left with, in the end, is a silhouette. A 29-year-old sergeant from New Jersey who welded some prongs to a tank and changed the way a battle was fought. A man who tried to give credit to another man and failed. A veteran who came home, resumed his life, and eventually died, leaving behind a footnote in military history and a puzzle that will probably never be solved. The Hedgerow Cutter itself has long since been consigned to museums and scrap heaps, its moment of tactical relevance confined to a few weeks in the summer of 1944. But the questions it raises, about how innovations happen, about who gets credit and why, about the gap between individual contribution and public recognition, remain as relevant as ever. Meanwhile, in the fields of Normandy, the embankments stand much as they have stood for centuries. The roots have grown back, the hedges have filled in, the shell craters have been smoothed over by rain and time. A visitor driving through the bocage today sees a landscape of small farms and winding roads, peaceful and timeless, giving little hint of the violence that once convulsed it. The monuments and cemeteries are there for those who look. The white crosses and stars of David marking American graves, the plaques commemorating specific actions and fallen units, but they exist in a pastoral setting that seems designed to deny their relevance. The cows graze, the apples ripen, the farmers tend their fields as their ancestors tended them before the war, and their descendants will tend them long after the last veteran is gone. It is here, in this ordinary agricultural landscape, that the Hedgerow Cutter story finds its proper context. The invention mattered because the bocage mattered, and the bocage mattered because human beings had been shaping it for generations, building up those embankments one stone and one root at a time, never imagining that their patient labour was creating a defensive terrain that would one day cost thousands of lives. The collision between ancient agricultural practice and modern mechanized warfare produced a problem that no one had anticipated, and that many of the most sophisticated military minds of the era struggled to solve. The solution came from a sergeant with a welding torch. That conjunction of the ancient and the modern, the planned and the improvised, the institutional and the individual, gives the Hedgerow Cutter story its enduring resonance, It is a story about the limits of planning, the importance of adaptability, and the irreducible contribution of the men on the ground who have to make things work when the theories fail. It is also a story about the arbitrary nature of fame, the ways in which the machinery of publicity selects and amplifies certain narratives while ignoring others, the injustice of a system that can celebrate one man while forgetting the comrade whose idea he built upon. These themes transcend the specific context of the Normandy campaign. They speak to universal questions about how organizations innovate, how societies remember, and how individuals navigate the gap between their own understanding of their lives and the stories that others tell about them. The summer light fades over the Norman fields, casting long shadows across the embankments where men once fought and died. Somewhere beneath the soil, fragments of metal still wait. Shell casings, vehicle parts, the detritus of mechanized warfare slowly oxidizing in the earth. Somewhere in an archive, the records of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron gather dust, preserving what they preserve and concealing what they conceal. Somewhere, if he ever existed at all, the man called Roberts passed through his own trajectory of service and homecoming and ordinary life, unaware that his offhand joke about saw teeth had sparked an invention that would help win a battle and change the course of a campaign. The last light catches the chrome of a display case in the Patton Museum at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Behind the glass, a set of steel prongs rests on a velvet backing, their edges still showing the rough cuts of field fabrication, the welds uneven in places where a torch moved too quickly or a hand grew tired. The placard identifies the artifact as a hedgerow cutter, dates it to July 1944, credits it to the ingenuity of American soldiers in Normandy. It does not mention Curtis Culin by name. It does not mention Roberts at all. The prongs themselves, removed from the Sherman tank that once carried them into battle, look almost primitive, heavy, blunt, functional in a way that suggests desperation rather than elegance. A visitor pausing before the case might wonder how something so crude could have mattered so much, might struggle to connect these rusted steel teeth with the grand strategic narratives of the Second World War. The answer lies not in the object itself, but in what the object made possible. The restoration of mobility to an army that had begun to fear it might be trapped indefinitely in the Norman hedgerows, fighting a war of attrition it could not afford to wage. The weeks immediately following the Rhino's introduction into widespread service mark one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in the entire European campaign. Between June 6th and mid-July 1944, American forces in the bocage had advanced at an agonizing pace, measuring gains in hundreds of yards rather than miles, losing men in numbers that senior commanders found deeply troubling. The terrain had imposed its own logic on the fighting, fragmenting battalions into isolated squads, negating the advantages of armour and air power, reducing combat to a series of brutal close-quarters engagements in which the defender almost always held the advantage. German forces, though outnumbered and increasingly short of supplies, had learned to exploit the bocage with devastating effectiveness, turning each hedgerow into a killing zone and each field into a trap. American commanders had tried everything they could think of: infantry assaults supported by artillery, engineer teams blowing gaps in the embankments, tanks attempting to bull their way through by brute force, and nothing had worked well enough to break the deadlock. The campaign was not failing exactly, but neither was it succeeding at the pace that strategic planning had demanded. Every day of delay gave the Germans more time to reinforce their positions, more time to bring up reserves, more time to prepare the defensive lines that would make the breakout from Normandy even more costly when it finally came. The Rhino changed the calculus. Not immediately, not universally, but with a cumulative effect that commanders noticed within days of the device's widespread deployment. Tanks that had been death traps in the bocage became weapons again, capable of punching through hedgerows at points of their own choosing, rather than funneling through the predictable gaps that German gunners had pre-registered with their anti-tank weapons. The psychological impact on American crews was immense. Men who had watched friends die in burning Shermans, who had learned to dread the moment when their tank's nose lifted toward the sky and exposed its belly to enemy fire, now found themselves crashing through embankments with something approaching confidence. The prongs bit into the earth. The tank stayed level. The wall of soil and roots exploded outward, and suddenly they were in the next field with their gun already traversing to engage whatever waited there. It was still dangerous. The bocage remained a killing ground, and German infantry with Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets could still destroy a Sherman at close range, but it was no longer suicidal. The balance had shifted. Operation Cobra, the breakout offensive that launched on July 25, 1944, demonstrated what American forces could accomplish when the hedgerow problem was at least partially solved. The operation began with the most concentrated aerial bombardment of the European war to that point, with over 1,500 heavy bombers dropping their loads on a narrow rectangle of German positions south of St. Lo. The bombing was horrific in its intensity, and not entirely accurate. Some American units were hit by their own aircraft, causing casualties that included Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theatre, but it shattered German defences along the target zone and created an opening that the ground forces were finally equipped to exploit. Rhino-fitted tanks led the advance, crashing through hedgerows that would have stopped them cold just weeks earlier, pressing forward with a speed that German commanders had not anticipated. Within 3 days, the American 7th Corps had broken through the German lines entirely. Within a week, the entire German position in Normandy was collapsing. By August 1st, American armoured columns were racing through Brittany and swinging east toward Paris, covering distances in days that had taken weeks in the bocage. The breakout that Allied planners had feared might take months had happened in a matter of days, and the Rhino tanks had played a role in making it possible. How large a role remains a matter of historical debate. Military historians who have examined the Normandy campaign with the benefit of decades of research and analysis have reached varying conclusions about the hedgerow cutter's actual tactical significance. Some, following the narrative established in contemporary press accounts and reinforced by Bradley's own memoir, treat the Rhino as a genuine war winner, the field expedient that broke the Bocage deadlock and enabled Operation Cobra to succeed. Others argue that the timing was largely coincidental, that the German defences were already weakening by mid-July due to attrition and supply shortages, and that the breakout would have happened with or without Culin's invention. The truth, as is so often the case in military history, probably lies somewhere between these positions. The Rhino did not single-handedly win the Battle of Normandy. No single weapon or tactic ever does. But it did solve a specific problem that had been causing significant casualties and slowing the American advance. It did restore offensive capability to armoured units that had been reduced to near impotence in the hedgerow terrain, and it did contribute to the speed and success of the Cobra breakout in ways that contemporaries found significant enough to celebrate. What the historical debate cannot capture, because the evidence does not exist to support it, is the experience of the men who actually used the Rhino in combat. The after-action reports and unit histories record what happened, which tanks broke through which hedgerows, which units advanced how far, which engagements resulted in what casualties. But they do not record what it felt like to be inside a Sherman when the prongs bit into an embankment, what sounds the crew heard as the tank shuddered and pushed forward, what they saw through their vision slits as the wall of earth and vegetation came apart around them. The documentary record preserves facts and outcomes, but not sensations or emotions. And the men who could have supplied those missing dimensions are almost all gone now, their memories lost with their passing. We know that the Rhino worked. We know that it mattered. We do not know, and probably never will know, exactly what it was like to depend on it for survival in the killing fields of the Bocage. The production of the hedgerow cutters themselves proceeded with an urgency that reflected the importance commanders attached to the device. Within hours of Bradley's order to equip as many tanks as possible with the Rhino modification, ordnance units across the First Army were setting up improvised production lines. The raw material came primarily from the same source Culin had used in his prototype: German beach obstacles captured during and after the D-Day landings. The Czech hedgehogs that the Wehrmacht had planted to tear open the hulls of landing craft were now being cut apart with acetylene torches and welded onto the fronts of American tanks to tear through German defensive positions. There was a poetic justice in this recycling that did not escape the men doing the work, though they had little time to appreciate it. The demand for rhinos far exceeded the capacity of any single unit to produce them, so the work was distributed across dozens of maintenance and ordnance teams, each fabricating cutters according to specifications that were themselves evolving as crews gained experience with the device in the field. The specifications were never fully standardized. Culin's original design called for 4 prongs arranged in a row across the tank's bow, but variations quickly emerged. Some tanks received 3 prongs, others 5 or 6, depending on what materials were available and what the fabricating crews thought would work best. The angle of the prongs, their length, their thickness, the way they were braced and reinforced, all of these details varied from unit to unit and sometimes from tank to tank within the same unit. The roughness of this field production is visible in the surviving examples, which show the marks of hasty work under pressure. Irregular welds, uneven cuts, reinforcements added where earlier versions had failed. The Rhino was never a product of industrial engineering. It remained throughout its period of use, an improvisation refined by trial and error. Its design shaped by the immediate feedback of combat, rather than the calculations of a drawing board. This gave it a quality that more carefully engineered equipment often lacked. It was perfectly adapted to the specific conditions it was meant to address, because those conditions had shaped it directly. The British contribution to the hedgerow cutter story deserves more attention than it has traditionally received. British forces operating in the eastern sector of the Normandy beachhead faced the same bocage terrain as their American allies, and they encountered the same tactical problems. When word of the American Rhino reached British commanders, they moved quickly to develop their own version, which they called the prong. The British prong was based on the same principle as Culin's device. Steel teeth welded to the tank's front to bite into embankments and prevent the vehicle from climbing, but it incorporated certain modifications that reflected British manufacturing capabilities and tactical preferences. British ordnance units eventually produced over 2,000 prongs, fitting them not only to Sherman tanks operated by British crews, but also to Cromwell tanks and various tank destroyer vehicles. The British effort was larger in scale than the American one, reflecting both the greater resources available to British manufacturing and the broader deployment of British armour in bocage terrain. The relationship between the American Rhino and the British prong illustrates how military innovations can spread and evolve across organisational boundaries during wartime. The two devices were not identical. British engineers made changes to the design based on their own analysis and their own operational experience, but they were clearly related, with the prong representing an adaptation and refinement of the concept that Culin had pioneered. The British gave credit to the Americans for the original idea, while claiming credit for their own improvements, a pattern that is common in the history of military technology, and that usually generates far more friction than it did in this case. The alliance between American and British forces in Normandy was close enough, and the practical urgency great enough, that questions of intellectual property and national pride took a back seat to the simple imperative of getting the devices into the field as quickly as possible. The production numbers themselves tell a story of organisational mobilisation under pressure. 500 American Rhinos fabricated in a matter of weeks, using salvaged German steel and the labour of maintenance crews working around the clock. Over 2,000 British prongs manufactured in a slightly longer time frame, drawing on the deeper industrial base that British forces could access from their home islands. Together, these roughly 2,500 devices transformed the capabilities of Allied armour in the bocage, giving tank crews a tool that at least partially offset the defensive advantages that the terrain had previously conferred on German forces. The transformation was not complete. Many tanks never received the modification, and even those that did remained vulnerable to determined German resistance. But it was significant enough that commanders noticed the difference, and attributed at least part of the Cobra success to it. The story of how the Rhino came to public attention reveals as much about the machinery of wartime propaganda as it does about the invention itself. In the immediate aftermath of Operation Cobra, with American forces racing across France and the Normandy deadlock broken, military public affairs officers began looking for stories that would illustrate American ingenuity and boost morale on the home front. The hedgerow cutter was perfect material, a clever invention, a dramatic problem solved, a sergeant's practical wisdom outperforming the calculations of generals and engineers. The story had human interest, it had drama, it had a clear hero in the form of Curtis Culin. It also had the advantage of being no longer operationally sensitive. By the time the press started covering the Rhino, the bocage fighting was over, and there was no risk that the publicity would reveal tactical secrets to the enemy. The coverage began in late August and early September 1944, as correspondents who had witnessed the breakout filed their stories and as military public affairs officers released information about the innovations that had made the advance possible. Cullin's name appeared in newspapers across the United States, often accompanied by photographs and detailed accounts of how he'd come up with the idea. The Cranford Citizen and Chronicle, his hometown paper, naturally gave the story extensive coverage, treating Culin as a local hero whose ingenuity had helped win a crucial battle. National publications picked up the story as well, running features that celebrated the sergeant's practical intelligence and presented the Rhino as proof that American can-do spirit could solve problems that stymied the experts. The coverage was almost entirely positive and almost entirely focused on Culin himself. Roberts, if he was mentioned at all, appeared as a minor figure. The man who had made a joke that Culin had taken seriously, a supporting player in a drama that belonged to someone else. The emphasis on Culin was partly a function of the journalistic conventions of the time, which preferred stories with clear individual heroes to more diffuse accounts of collective effort. It was also partly a function of the information that was available to reporters, who relied primarily on military sources that had already identified Culin as the inventor and credited him accordingly. The nuances of the story, the collaborative nature of the brainstorming session, Roberts's initial suggestion, Cullin's own attempts to share credit, were either unknown to the journalists covering the story or deemed insufficiently dramatic to include. Culin himself appears to have been ambivalent about the attention. The available evidence suggests that he tried, at least initially, to ensure that Roberts received recognition for his contribution. In accounts given shortly after the invention's success, Culin reportedly emphasized that the original idea had come from someone else and that he had merely taken that idea and made it work. But the machinery of publicity, once set in motion, proved difficult to redirect. The press wanted a hero, and Culin fit the role. Roberts, whoever he was, did not fit the role. He was shadowy, hard to identify, possibly not even traceable by the time journalists started looking. The story simplified itself in the telling, as stories do, and the simplification favoured the man whose name was known over the man whose name was lost. The awards and recognition that followed the Rhino's success went primarily to Culin. He received the Legion of Merit, one of the higher decorations available to American service members, for his contribution to the hedgerow cutter's development. The citation praised his initiative and ingenuity, his willingness to experiment with an untested idea, his role in solving a problem that had stymied the Allied advance. It did not mention Roberts. Other forms of recognition followed, mentions in unit histories, inclusion in accounts of the Normandy campaign, the lasting association of his name with the invention he had helped create. Culin became, in the official record and in popular memory, the inventor of the Rhino tank, the sergeant whose welding torch had changed the course of a battle. The recognition was not undeserved. Culin had done the work of turning an idea into a functioning device, had taken the risk of proposing an unauthorized modification to government equipment, had demonstrated the invention to skeptical superiors and convinced them of its value. These were genuine contributions, and they merit the acknowledgement they received. But the recognition was also incomplete, because it failed to account for the collaborative nature of innovation, the way that ideas pass from mind to mind and accumulate contributions along the way. Roberts's joke about sawteeth was not the Rhino. It was a spark, a starting point, a suggestion that required substantial development before it could become a working tool. But without that spark, there would have been no Rhino for Culin to develop. The two contributions were different in kind but connected in causation, and the historical record's emphasis on one while forgetting the other represents a distortion of how the innovation actually occurred. This distortion is not unique to the hedgerow cutter story. It appears throughout the history of invention and innovation, wherever the complex reality of collaborative development collides with the cultural preference for individual heroes. Thomas Edison did not invent the light bulb alone. He built on the work of dozens of predecessors and employed teams of assistants who contributed ideas and labour to the final product. The Wright brothers did not invent powered flight in isolation. They drew on the accumulated knowledge of aeronautical experimenters across decades and multiple continents. In each case, the popular narrative simplifies a complex story into a tale of individual genius, because that is the kind of story that audiences find satisfying and that the machinery of publicity finds easy to tell. Culin and Roberts fit this pattern perfectly. One man gets the credit, the other fades into obscurity, and the reality of shared contribution is lost. The question of what became of Roberts, his full name, his unit, his fate after Normandy, has occupied historians and researchers for decades, with frustratingly little to show for the effort. The identity that Culin himself tried to preserve has proven remarkably resistant to recovery. Military records from the period are vast but imperfectly indexed, and the name Roberts was common enough in the American armed forces that searching for a single individual without additional identifying information, a first name, a serial number, a specific unit assignment, becomes an exercise in navigating an ocean of near matches and false leads. Some researchers have speculated that Roberts may have been killed in action before the Rhino's success brought the hedgerow cutter to wider attention, which would explain both his absence from subsequent accounts and the difficulty in tracing him. Others have suggested that Roberts may not have been his actual surname at all, that Roberts was a nickname, a corruption, or a misremembering that calcified into the historical record before anyone thought to verify it. Still, others have proposed that Roberts, if he survived the war, may have simply chosen not to claim credit for his contribution, either because he genuinely did not believe his offhand remark merited recognition, or because he had no interest in the publicity that would have accompanied such a claim. None of these theories can be confirmed. The trail goes cold in the summer of 1944, somewhere in the hedgerow country, and does not resume. Roberts remains a figure defined entirely by his absence, a voice that spoke a few words in an informal conversation among soldiers, words that lodged in another man's mind and eventually changed the shape of a campaign, and then silence. The historical record preserves the echo but not the source. What the record does preserve in considerable detail is the transformation that the Rhino tanks brought to the battlefield once they entered service in significant numbers. The weeks leading up to Operation Cobra had been a period of grinding frustration for American commanders. The initial landings had succeeded beyond the most pessimistic projections. The Omaha beach nightmare notwithstanding, all 5 invasion beaches had been secured and a continuous lodgment established along a 60-mile stretch of the Normandy coast. But the exploitation phase, the push inland that was supposed to shatter German defences and open the road to Paris, had stalled in the bocage. Progress was measured in hundreds of yards per day, sometimes less. Casualties mounted. The sense of momentum that had accompanied the landings dissipated, replaced by a growing unease that the campaign might bog down into the kind of attritional struggle that commanders on both sides had hoped to avoid. The British and Canadian forces on the eastern flank of the beachhead faced their own challenges around Caen, where German armoured reserves had concentrated in strength. But the American sector, stretching westward through the heart of the hedgerow country, presented a different kind of problem. Not a fortress city defended by massed panzers, but an endless succession of small fields, each one a potential ambush site, each one requiring its own separate assault. The tactical arithmetic was brutal. A rifle company attacking across a single hedgerow-enclosed field might take casualties of 10 to 15%, killed, wounded, missing, in the process of clearing that one field. There might be 50 or 100 such fields between the company's starting position and its daily objective. The Germans, fighting defensively on terrain they had spent weeks fortifying, could afford to trade space for time, withdrawing methodically from one field to the next, bleeding the attackers at every step. The Americans could not afford to absorb those casualties indefinitely, not when the replacements flowing in from England could barely keep pace with the losses, and the timeline for liberating France was slipping further behind schedule with each passing week. The Rhino tanks altered this equation in ways that became apparent almost immediately upon their deployment. A hedgerow assault supported by conventional armour required careful coordination. Infantry had to advance ahead of the tanks, locating and suppressing enemy positions that might threaten the vehicles as they attempted to crest the embankment. The tanks themselves could provide fire support, but their primary function, mobile protected firepower capable of accompanying infantry across the battlefield, was constrained by their vulnerability during the transition from one field to the next. A tank caught halfway over a hedgerow, nose pointed skyward and belly exposed, was a tank that could not fight, could not manoeuvre, could not do anything except present itself as a target. The moments of maximum exposure were predictable, and German anti-tank crews became skilled at exploiting them. The Rhino changed the geometry of the assault. A tank fitted with Culin's device no longer had to choose between the slow, loud, predictable method of blasting through an embankment with explosives and the fast, vulnerable method of climbing over the top. It could approach the hedgerow at speed, drive the prongs into the base of the earthen wall, and plough straight through in a shower of dirt and torn roots, emerging into the next field with its bow gun already oriented forward and its hull never significantly elevated above the horizontal. The exposure time, the critical seconds during which the tank was vulnerable and unable to return effective fire, dropped from 10 or 15 seconds to 2 or 3. German anti-tank gunners, trained to fire at the precise moment when a tank's belly became visible, found their window of opportunity collapsing. The first shot was still often possible, but the follow-up shot, the adjustment, the careful aim that turned a near miss into a kill, that required time the Rhino assault no longer provided. The psychological dimension of this shift should not be underestimated. Tank crews who had spent weeks watching fellow crews die during hedgerow crossings, watching the fireball erupt as a round punched through thin belly armour and detonated ammunition or fuel, now had a tool that made the crossing survivable. The fear did not disappear. No modification to a tank's equipment could eliminate the knowledge that a German gunner might be waiting in the next field, that any crossing might be the last. But the odds had shifted, and soldiers are acutely sensitive to shifts in odds. A crew that had learned to dread the hedgerow transition as the most dangerous moment of any assault could now approach that transition with something closer to confidence. They were no longer sitting ducks. They were rhinos, and rhinos charged. The infantry noticed the difference. American foot soldiers in the bocage had developed a complicated relationship with the tanks that were supposed to support them. On one hand, the tanks represented firepower, protection, the ability to suppress enemy positions and destroy strongpoints that infantry weapons could not touch. On the other hand, tanks drew fire. An infantryman advancing near a tank knew that German gunners would prioritize the vehicle, and the rounds that missed the tank, or the secondary explosions when a tank was hit, posed their own dangers to nearby soldiers on foot. The calculus was further complicated by the knowledge that tank crews, understandably protective of their vehicles and their lives, sometimes hesitated to expose themselves to situations where the odds seemed unfavourable. A tank commander who had watched 3 Shermans brew up during hedgerow crossings that morning might be reluctant to attempt a 4th crossing that afternoon, even if the infantry he was supposed to support desperately needed the firepower he could provide. The Rhino tanks changed this dynamic by changing the risk profile of the operation. Tank crews who had been hesitant became more willing to press forward when forward no longer meant belly first into an anti-tank gun's sights. The tempo of combined arms operations increased. Infantry assaults that had been carefully planned and deliberately paced could now be conducted with greater speed and aggression, because the armour support those assaults depended on was more reliably available. The whole system, infantry, armour, artillery, engineers working together to reduce the hedgerow country field by field, began to function with something closer to the fluidity that pre-invasion planners had envisioned and the bocage had so thoroughly disrupted. The scope of the manufacturing effort in the days before Operation Cobra reflected the urgency that American commanders attached to the Rhino program. Every ordnance unit that could be spared from other tasks was directed to begin cutting, welding, and fitting the prong assemblies. The source material, captured German beach obstacles, was abundant. The Wehrmacht had planted thousands of Czech hedgehogs along the invasion beaches, and those obstacles, no longer needed for their original defensive purpose, now littered the shoreline and the fields immediately inland. Work parties collected the scrap steel and trucked it to improvised fabrication sites, where welders worked through the night by the light of acetylene torches. The designs varied slightly from unit to unit, as different ordnance crews experimented with prong configurations, angles, and mounting arrangements. Some versions used 4 prongs, others 5 or 6. Some mounted the prongs low on the bow plate, others slightly higher. The underlying principle remained constant. Steel tusks, angled forward and down, designed to bite into the hedgerow embankment and hold the tank level during the breakthrough, but the implementation reflected the decentralized improvisational character of the entire endeavor. General Bradley, watching the fabrication effort proceed, issued orders that the Rhino tanks were to be kept under wraps until the moment of the Cobra offensive. The element of surprise was too valuable to risk. If German intelligence learned that American armour had solved the hedgerow problem, the defenders would have time to develop countermeasures. Deeper anti-tank ditches, thicker embankments, new tactics designed to exploit whatever vulnerabilities the Rhino configuration might introduce. Better to let the Germans believe they were still facing the same cautious, hedgerow-bound American tanks they had been fighting for weeks, and then hit them with something they had not anticipated. The operational security was imperfect. Some rumours filtered through the lines, some captured equipment may have provided clues, but the Germans appear to have been largely unprepared for what they encountered when Cobra commenced. Operation Cobra began on July 25, 1944, with a massive aerial bombardment intended to shatter German defensive positions along a narrow corridor west of St. Lo. The bombing was controversial and costly. Short rounds fell on American lines, killing over 100 soldiers and wounding nearly 500 more, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theatre, but the weight of explosives that did reach German positions had the intended effect. When American ground forces advanced into the bombardment zone, they found defenders dazed, deafened, buried, or dead. The initial breakthroughs came faster than expected, and then the Rhino tanks began to demonstrate what they could do. The bocage did not disappear on the first day of Cobra. The hedgerows were still there, the fields still enclosed, the terrain still offering defensive advantages to anyone determined to exploit them. But the equation had changed. American tank columns moved through the hedgerow country with a speed and confidence that had been impossible 6 weeks earlier. The Rhino-equipped Shermans punched through embankment after embankment, clearing paths for the infantry following behind, providing fire support that no longer evaporated at the first hedgerow crossing. German defensive positions that might have held for hours under the old conditions were overrun in minutes. The whole tempo of operations accelerated, and with that acceleration came the sense, felt by commanders, by soldiers, by observers watching from London and Washington, that something fundamental had shifted. The breakout from Normandy, when it came fast. Within a week of Cobra's launch, American forces had torn a hole in the German lines that the defenders could not seal. Armoured columns poured through the gap, racing south and then east in sweeping movements that encircled German divisions and made retreat impossible for tens of thousands of enemy soldiers. The bocage, which had seemed like an impenetrable maze a month earlier, was suddenly behind them. Open tank country lay ahead, and American armour was built for exactly that kind of warfare. The race across France that followed, Patton's Third Army swooping toward Paris, the liberation of the capital in late August, the headlong pursuit of retreating German forces toward the borders of the Reich, all of it flowed from the breach that Cobra had opened. How much credit belongs to the Rhino tanks for this transformation? The question has occupied military historians since the campaign ended, and the answers remain contested. Some analysts argue that the Rhino was decisive, that without Culin's invention, Operation Cobra would have bogged down in the hedgerows just as the earlier advances had, and the breakout from Normandy would have been delayed by weeks or even months, with incalculable consequences for the broader course of the war. Others argue that the Rhino's contribution, while real, has been exaggerated, that the success of Cobra owed more to the massive aerial bombardment, to the concentration of forces, to the weakened state of German defences after weeks of attrition, than to any single piece of equipment. Still others occupy a middle position, acknowledging the Rhino's tactical importance, while questioning whether it was truly indispensable, whether American forces might have found other solutions if Culin's device had never been invented. The evidence supports a nuanced assessment. The Rhino tanks did not win the Battle of Normandy by themselves. No single weapon, no single innovation, ever wins a battle in isolation. The outcome of Cobra reflected the cumulative efforts of thousands of soldiers, the application of overwhelming firepower, the exhaustion of German reserves, the logistical advantages that American industrial capacity provided, and yes, the tactical improvements that the Rhino made possible. To credit Culin's invention with the entire victory would be to commit the same error of oversimplification that credited Culin alone for an invention that Roberts had helped spark. But to deny the Rhino's contribution, to argue that the same outcome would have occurred without it, would be equally mistaken. The hedgerow problem was real, and it was serious, and it had stymied the Allied advance for over a month. The Rhino solved that problem, or at least mitigated it sufficiently that the advance could resume. The timing of its deployment, immediately before the Cobra offensive, meant that its effects were felt at precisely the moment when breaking the deadlock mattered most. Perhaps the most telling evidence comes from the soldiers themselves. In letters, diaries, and post-war interviews, American tankers who fought in the bocage consistently described the Rhino tanks as transformative. They speak of the fear that accompanied every hedgerow crossing before the prongs were fitted, the sense of helplessness as their tank tilted upward and their belly armour pointed toward the sky. They speak of the relief that came with the Rhino configuration, the confidence of being able to drive straight through an embankment instead of climbing over it. These are subjective impressions, not objective measures, but they matter. Soldiers' morale affects soldiers' performance, and soldiers' performance affects battles. The Rhino tanks made American tankers feel capable of doing their jobs, and that feeling translated into willingness to take risks, to push forward, to maintain the tempo of operations that commanders demanded. The morale effect extended beyond the tank crews themselves. Infantry soldiers, watching Rhino-equipped Shermans punch through hedgerows, understood that the stalemate they had endured for weeks was ending. The sense of futility that had begun to set in. The feeling that the bocage would swallow them forever, that every field cleared would simply reveal another field to clear, that the war would grind on indefinitely among the hedgerows, lifted. Something had changed. Progress was possible again. The Germans, who had seemed so comfortably entrenched in their defensive positions, were suddenly on the defensive in a different sense, reacting to American movements instead of shaping them. The psychological momentum of the campaign shifted, and that shift preceded the physical breakthroughs that Operation Cobra achieved. Curtis Culin did not participate in the Cobra offensive as a combat soldier. By the time the operation launched, he had already been transferred away from frontline duties, his expertise in the hedgerow cutter deemed more valuable in a training and demonstration capacity than in direct combat. This was common practice in the army. Soldiers who possessed specialized knowledge or skills were often pulled back from the fighting so that their knowledge could be disseminated to others. Culin spent the latter part of the summer of 1944 teaching other units how to fabricate and use the Rhino device, showing tank crews the techniques that worked best for approaching and penetrating hedgerows, answering the endless questions that arose as soldiers encountered situations their training had not anticipated. It was during this period that the publicity began in earnest. American newspapers, hungry for stories of individual heroism and ingenuity, discovered the tale of the sergeant who had invented the device that was helping win the Battle of Normandy. Cullin's name began appearing in print, accompanied by photographs of Sherman tanks sporting their distinctive prongs. The narrative took shape. A common soldier, not a general or an engineer or a scientist, had solved a problem that had stumped the entire Allied command. It was exactly the kind of story that wartime audiences wanted to hear, proof that American resourcefulness and initiative could triumph over any obstacle. The Cranford Citizen and Chronicle ran its first story on Curtis Culin in September 1944, introducing readers back home to a local boy who had made good in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. The article described the hedgerow cutter in glowing terms, credited Culin with its invention, and painted a picture of American battlefield ingenuity triumphing over German defensive preparation. Readers in Cranford learned that one of their own had contributed meaningfully to the liberation of France, and the town embraced the story with enthusiasm. Cullin's family found themselves the subject of local attention, neighbours stopping by to offer congratulations, acquaintances suddenly eager to claim a connection to the young sergeant, whose name was appearing in papers across the country. What the articles did not mention, what almost none of the contemporary coverage mentioned, was Roberts. Culin himself tried to correct the record. In interviews conducted during and after the war, he consistently credited the unnamed soldier whose offhand joke had sparked the idea. He described the conversation in the motor pool, the absurd suggestion about welding saw teeth onto a tank, his own flash of recognition that the joke contained something real. He was careful to distinguish between the initial concept and the engineering work that followed, acknowledging that the idea's genesis lay with someone else even as he took responsibility for developing it into a functional device. But the press had little interest in complications. The story of a single ingenious sergeant played better than the story of a group of soldiers brainstorming together, and journalists simplified accordingly. Roberts remained a footnote when he appeared at all. The identity of Roberts himself has never been definitively established. Military historians have searched unit rosters, interviewed surviving veterans, examined contemporary documents, and come away with nothing conclusive. The nickname Roberts may have referred to a soldier's actual surname, or it may have been a nickname derived from some other source entirely. The 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, like every unit in the army, cycled through personnel as men were killed, wounded, transferred, or rotated out of combat. By the time historians began looking for Roberts in earnest, Decades had passed, and the trail had gone cold. Some researchers have speculated that Roberts may not have survived the war, that the soldier who first imagined cutting through hedgerows with tank-mounted teeth may have died in the fighting before anyone thought to record his full name and service history. Others have suggested that Roberts, whoever he was, may simply have had no interest in claiming credit, that he may have viewed his contribution as too minor to merit attention, or that he may have been uncomfortable with the publicity that Culin received and preferred anonymity. The truth, whatever it is, remains unknown. Roberts exists in the historical record only as a ghost, a presence felt but never fully seen, his contribution acknowledged by the one person best positioned to acknowledge it and largely ignored by everyone else. The irony was not lost on Culin. In a war fought by millions of soldiers, recognition was distributed unevenly, shaped as much by chance and circumstance as by actual contribution. The sergeant who had insisted on crediting Roberts found himself unable to give that credit any lasting traction. The narrative had already solidified around him, and he lacked the power to reshape it. He could tell the truth in interviews, could correct journalists who called him the sole inventor, could point again and again to the conversation that had started everything, but none of it stuck. The story the public wanted was simpler than the truth, and simpler stories win. Culin received the Legion of Merit for his invention of the hedgerow cutter, a significant decoration that recognised his contribution to the Allied victory. The citation praised his initiative, his technical skill, and his determination to solve a problem that had defied conventional approaches. It made no mention of Roberts. The medal joined the other decorations Culin accumulated over the course of the war, tangible recognition of service that would follow him for the rest of his life. But the war was not over, and Culin was not finished fighting. By autumn 1944, the Allied advance had pushed deep into France, and the bocage was behind them. The hedgerow country that had consumed so much blood and time receded into memory as the armies moved east toward the German frontier. The Rhino tanks, their purpose served, remained in service but no longer represented the cutting edge of tactical innovation. New problems demanded new solutions, and the war's centre of gravity shifted. Culin, his expertise in hedgerow warfare now less critical, returned to combat duties. He was assigned to the 3rd Armoured Division, one of the most heavily engaged armoured formations in the European theatre, and he went back to doing what he had done before, serving as a tanker in a war that was far from finished. The fighting that followed was some of the most brutal of the entire campaign. The 3rd Armoured Division pushed into Germany itself, engaging in the close-quarters combat that characterised the final months of the war in Europe. German resistance, far from collapsing, stiffened as the Allies approached the Reich's borders. Every town, every crossroads, every stretch of forest became a potential battleground, and American tankers paid the price for every mile gained. The Sherman tanks that had been adequate for the fighting in France proved increasingly vulnerable to the heavier German vehicles and anti-tank weapons they encountered, and casualties among tank crews mounted steadily. Curtis Culin was wounded twice during this period. The details of his injuries are not fully documented in available sources, but the fact of them is clear. He was hit, recovered, returned to duty, was hit again. This was the reality of armoured warfare in 1944 and 1945, a grinding attrition that wore down men and machines alike. The sergeant who had invented the Rhino tank became just another wounded tanker, one of thousands cycling through field hospitals and replacement depots, patched up and sent back to the line because the army needed every trained man it could get. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, and Curtis Culin survived it. He had entered the conflict as a young man from New Jersey with no particular claim to fame, and he emerged from it as a decorated veteran whose name was known, at least in certain circles, as the inventor of a device that had helped break the deadlock in Normandy. He returned home to a country eager to put the war behind it, to resume the normal rhythms of civilian life that the conflict had interrupted. Like millions of other veterans, he faced the challenge of reintegrating into a society that had changed in his absence, of finding work and building a life in a post-war world that bore little resemblance to the one he had left. The years that followed were quiet ones, at least as far as the historical record is concerned. Culin did not become a celebrity, did not parlay his wartime fame into a public career, did not write a memoir or embark on a lecture circuit. He lived the kind of life that most veterans lived, private, ordinary, marked by the same concerns and satisfactions that occupied everyone else. He married, raised a family, worked. The Rhino tank receded into the past, a chapter of his life that he had closed. When historians or journalists occasionally sought him out, he cooperated, answering their questions and sharing his memories, but he did not seek attention. The man who had insisted on crediting Roberts remained uncomfortable with the spotlight that had been trained on him, and he spent his post-war years largely outside it. The broader story of the Rhino tank followed a similar trajectory. In the immediate aftermath of the war, it was remembered as one of many examples of American ingenuity, a feel-good tale of frontline innovation that fit neatly into the national narrative of the conflict. But as the years passed and the war receded from living memory, the Rhino faded into the specialized literature of military history known to scholars and enthusiasts but largely forgotten by the general public. The bocage itself returned to its pre-war anonymity, a patchwork of fields and hedgerows in a corner of France that tourists passed through on their way to the D-Day beaches without understanding what had happened there. The farmers whose ancestors had built those hedgerows resumed their lives, and the landscape that had consumed so many soldiers swallowed all trace of the fighting that had scarred it. What remains, when the details have been sifted and the sources have been weighed? The Rhino tank was real, and it worked. This much is beyond dispute. American soldiers welded steel prongs to the fronts of their Sherman tanks, and those prongs allowed the tanks to penetrate hedgerow embankments without exposing their vulnerable undersides to enemy fire. The device spread rapidly through the First Army in the weeks before Operation Cobra, and by the time that offensive launched, a substantial majority of American tanks in the theatre had been converted. British forces adopted their own version, manufacturing thousands of units for their own armoured vehicles. The idea that began as a joke in a motor pool became standard equipment across two Allied armies. The impact of the device on the actual course of the campaign is harder to quantify. Military historians continue to debate the relative importance of the Rhino tanks in enabling the Cobra breakout, with some arguing that they were decisive and others suggesting that their contribution has been exaggerated by popular accounts. The honest answer is that certainty is impossible. Too many variables were in play, too many factors contributed to the outcome, too much depends on counterfactual reasoning that can never be tested. What can be said is that the Rhino tanks addressed a real tactical problem at a critical moment, and that they were perceived by the soldiers who used them as making a meaningful difference. The morale effect at minimum was real. The story of the invention itself carries its own lessons, ones that extend beyond the specific context of the Normandy campaign. Curtis Culin was not an engineer, not a scientist, not a professional inventor. He was a sergeant, a tank crewman, a man whose formal qualifications consisted of whatever training the army had given him and whatever practical skills he had picked up along the way. The idea that sparked the hedgerow cutter came not from him, but from another soldier, a man known only as Roberts, who tossed off a joke that Culin happened to take seriously. The materials used to build the first prototype came from enemy beach obstacles, scavenged from the defences the Germans had constructed to prevent the very invasion that had now succeeded. Everything about the device's creation was improvised, unofficial, outside the normal channels of military procurement and development. This is not how innovation is supposed to work, according to the organisational charts and procurement regulations that govern modern militaries. Research and development are supposed to happen in laboratories, conducted by credentialed experts working within established programs. New equipment is supposed to pass through testing and evaluation, to be approved by boards and committees, to enter service through formal channels that ensure quality control and accountability. The Rhino tank followed none of these procedures. It was fabricated in the field by soldiers who had no authorization to modify government property, using materials that had never been inspected or approved for the purpose. By any conventional standard, it should not have happened. But it did happen, and it worked, and it spread through the army faster than any official program could have managed. The soldiers who needed a solution found one, built it themselves, and demonstrated it to commanders who were wise enough to recognize its value and powerful enough to order its adoption. The system, in this case, proved flexible enough to accommodate innovation from below, to accept a good idea regardless of its source. This was not inevitable. Military organisations are not known for their receptiveness to suggestions from enlisted men, and plenty of good ideas have died because the people who had them lacked the rank or the connections to get them heard. Culin was lucky that Lieutenant General Bradley came to see his demonstration, lucky that Bradley was the kind of commander who could recognise what he was looking at and act on it immediately. A different general, more invested in procedure and hierarchy, might have referred the matter to a committee and let it die there. The war was full of such moments, small decisions that shaped large outcomes, individual actions that rippled outward in ways their authors never anticipated. Curtis Culin did not set out to change the course of the Normandy campaign. He set out to solve a problem that was getting his fellow soldiers killed, and he found a solution that happened to be scalable. The gap between those two things, the local intention and the large consequence, is where history happens, in the space where individual choices intersect with circumstances beyond any individual's control. Roberts, whoever he was, made a joke. Culin heard something in it that others missed. Together, in a conversation that lasted only a few minutes and was never formally recorded, they set in motion a chain of events that would affect the lives of thousands of soldiers and possibly the timing of the Allied victory in France. Neither of them could have known this at the time. Neither of them was trying to make history. They were just soldiers, doing what soldiers do, coping with the situation in front of them as best they could. This is how it often works. The great events that fill history books are built from countless smaller events that no one thought to record. Decisions made by people whose names were never written down, conversations that took place and were immediately forgotten by everyone except those who happened to act on them. The Rhino tank is unusual, only in that enough of the story survived to be reconstructed, that Culin lived to tell it, and made a point of telling it accurately, that historians took the time to track down the sources and piece together what happened. For every Culin, there are 100 soldiers whose contributions were equally real and equally unrecognised, whose innovations saved lives or changed outcomes without ever being attributed to them. The hedgerows of Normandy are still there. The embankments that Norman farmers built over centuries, the walls of earth and root that swallowed American tanks in the summer of 1944, remain part of the landscape. They are lower now, in many places, worn down by time and modern agriculture, but the basic pattern of the bocage persists. Farmers still work the small enclosed fields that gave the region its character, still maintain the boundaries that their ancestors established. The tourists who visit the D-Day beaches sometimes drive through this countryside without understanding what they're seeing, without recognising that the pleasant pastoral landscape around them was once a killing ground, where men fought and died for every field, every hedgerow, every yard of muddy Norman soil. The cemeteries are there too. The American Military Cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer, overlooking Omaha Beach, holds the remains of more than 9,000 American soldiers who died in the Normandy campaign, their graves marked by white crosses and stars of David, arranged in perfect rows across a manicured lawn. Other cemeteries, American and British and Canadian and German, dot the region, each one a silent testament to the cost of the fighting that took place there. The soldiers buried in those cemeteries include men who died in the bocage, tankers whose vehicles were destroyed by German guns, infantrymen who fell in the endless struggle from hedgerow to hedgerow. Some of them might have lived if the Rhino tank had been invented sooner, if the solution to the hedgerow problem had been found in June instead of July. Others might have died regardless, casualties of a war that consumed lives faster than any device could save them. Curtis Culin died in 1963, at the age of 48. He had lived long enough to see the war recede into history, to watch the world he had helped save move on to new concerns and new conflicts. His obituary mentioned his wartime service and his invention of the hedgerow cutter, identifying him one last time as the sergeant who had helped break the deadlock in Normandy. He was buried with the honours due a decorated veteran, his contribution to the Allied victory formally acknowledged, even as the details of how that contribution came about faded from public memory. Roberts, if he survived the war, left no trace that historians have been able to find. His contribution, the joke that started everything, the spark that Culin fanned into flame, remains uncredited in any official sense, acknowledged only in Cullin's own words and in the accounts of those who heard Culin tell the story. He is a gap in the record, a presence defined by absence, the unknown soldier whose idea outlived him. The Rhino tank itself has become a footnote in most histories of the Second World War, mentioned briefly if at all, overshadowed by the larger events it helped enable. The breakout from Normandy, the liberation of Paris, the drive across France and into Germany. These are the set pieces that dominate the narrative, the events that fill the documentaries and the textbooks. The hedgerow cutter appears, when it appears, as a curiosity, an example of frontline ingenuity that solved a specific problem and then passed from the scene. Its moment of importance was brief, a few weeks in the summer of 1944, and history has treated it accordingly. But for the soldiers who were there, who lived through the Bocage fighting and survived to tell about it, the Rhino tank was not a footnote. It was the thing that changed everything, the device that turned an impossible situation into a manageable one, the proof that someone had heard their complaints and found an answer. They remembered the fear of the old hedgerow crossings and the relief of the new ones, the difference between climbing and crashing, between exposure and protection. They remembered the prongs bolted to the front of their tanks, the crude steel tusks that made them feel like they might actually survive. They remembered, and some of them wrote letters, gave interviews, told their children and grandchildren about the sergeant who had saved their lives with a welding torch and some scrap metal. This is perhaps the truest measure of the Rhino tank's importance. Not the strategic assessments of historians, not the debates about counterfactuals and turning points, but the memories of the men who used it. They knew what the bocage had been like before the prongs were fitted, and they knew what it was like after. The difference was the difference between despair and hope, between feeling trapped and feeling capable, between waiting to die and believing they might live. No calculation of strategic impact can capture that difference, but it was real, and it mattered, and it is the legacy that Curtis Culin and the unknown Roberts left behind. Somewhere in the hedgerow country, in a field that looks much like any other field, there is a spot where a Sherman tank once crashed through an ancient embankment, its steel prongs biting into the earth, its engine roaring, dirt and roots flying in all directions. The embankment has long since been repaired, the field returned to cultivation, the war erased from the visible landscape. No marker identifies the place, no plaque commemorates what happened there. The farmers who work the land may not even know that it was ever a battlefield, that men once fought and died within sight of their barns and houses, but the fighting happened, and the Rhino tanks were there, and somewhere beneath the surface of that Norman soil, fragments of steel and shell casings and the rusted remnants of war still lie buried, waiting for the plough to turn them up. The hedgerows endure, as they have endured for centuries, indifferent to the brief violence that once convulsed them. And in the archives, in the brittle pages of wartime newspapers and the fading transcripts of veterans' interviews, the story of a sergeant named Culin and a soldier called Roberts survives, incomplete, imperfect but real, a small piece of a vast war, a reminder that history is made not only by generals and presidents, but by ordinary people who see a problem and refuse to accept that it cannot be solved.